And so my second D on dialogues and my third D on dreams will be, for many people, they will want to squeeze those out or condition those very much by the first D, deficits, and that you really can't dream for a while. Put those on hold. Or there's no use really having much dialogue because the numbers speak for themselves. The deficit's too big. You can't really say much else other than, yikes, we better pay down the deficit. I would ask you to be skeptical of those who say that to you. There's always room for discussion. There's something anti-democratic to tell people the numbers are too big, the deficit is all we can think about, thank you very much, come back 5 years from now. Budgets are always about choices. Give you an example. Part of the discussion will be how much of the deficit is cyclical, i.e. a response to the ups and downs of economic activity, the booms and the busts, the good times, the bad times, the growth periods, the recessions. It looks like, touch wood so far, that we've averted a depression, that we are indeed just in a recession. And statistically, we might be actually even out of it by now. I mean, Statistics Canada may tell us in the next quarter that we've had now 4 or 8 months of sustained economic growth in a positive above zero. We might still be having job losses, so whether it's a jobless recovery, as some people refer to it, but that's getting at the argument of that a lot of this is a cyclical phenomenon, that we've fallen into it, and as we went into the recession, we saw massive job losses, as Denise said, hundreds of thousands. We've seen the cost of the employment insurance budgets, EI, go up quite substantially. In fact, this year, by the government's own projections, the amount of money collected through premiums is not sufficient to cover the benefits going out. So for the first year in 16 years, the UI account, which is a nominal accounting fiction,
very nominal,
as the Auditor General of Canada will point out, among others. But if you take the numbers at face value, will be a shortfall. So the fund, but that is to be predicted. That's what these sorts of programs are meant to do: collect surpluses in their good times and spend them out and go into the red, even if necessary. The last thing we should be doing right now is raising EI premiums to finance EI benefits, because that would be a further depressing effect on economic recovery. So we should have a fund. How big it is another question, and how transparent and honest governments have been, Liberal and the current government, to explain to Canadians the size of these accounts and so forth. But what's interesting in Mr. Flaherty's forecast is that very quickly, within a couple of years, we'll be back into a surplus in EI accounts. We will be collecting more than we'll be paying out in EI. And in fact, in 3 or 4 years, we'll be, according to his own projections, generating surpluses of upwards of $20 billion a year again. Maybe on the EI account alone. Even though overall we'll still be in a deficit for the government bottom line, Denise, within that just one activity, we'll be generating very healthy surpluses, which again suggests to me that there's some room here for dialogue and dreams, or even nightmares if you want, but to be troubled. But there are choices being made there for those projections. So that's the other flip side of a deficit, is how much of it's structural. Now, the government will suggest that the deficit, by and large, is cyclical, and we will grow out of it. Almost, and both Mr. Ignatieff and his party, and Mr. Harper and his party have and Denise can speak for Owen's party, but is that we'll almost painlessly grow out of the deficits. We're not going to raise taxes to collect more revenues to pay the deficit, and we're not going to cut spending to close the gap. So somehow we're just going to, in a very happy way, grow back out of it without having to do any political pain on either side of the ledger. And those are basically the two ways to eliminate a deficit, right? You raise taxes and you cut spending. You do one or both or a combination of some. But it's early days yet, and the hope, I think, of all politicians around the world is that growth will come back to most of the global economy in the next 6 months. The G20, the G8, everybody, the OECD, and all the major economic associations and finance ministers and forecasters. But what if they're wrong? Well, we'll get to that later. But so the structural one, then, though, is what part of the deficit is due to explicit policy choices made by governments that create a gap that persists between revenue and spending. You're either you're doing too much of one and not of the other, or vice versa. I'll give you an example of what I would call a structural, part of the structural deficit is, and this is controversial, but I'll put it out there, cutting the GST from 7 down to 6 down to 5. It was a political choice. Government didn't have to do it. What if they hadn't done it? What if we're still at 7? Well, we'd be collecting about $12 to $14 billion a year more than we are. So government of Canada has foregone revenues of, and even in a recession, say that sagged a bit, arguably $10 to $12 billion a year. So we wouldn't necessarily have a $56 billion deficit. We'd have a 46 or a 45 or even lower. Or if we deferred other tax changes. Now, that's a permanent decision until another government has the courage to raise GST or HST, as we're about to experience here. But that's now a structural feature of public policy at the federal level, GST of 5. And as long as it's there, it means that governments, now that's, we can argue whether it should be 5, 6, or 7, but bringing it from 7 down to 5 was a clear political choice. Apparently reaped some political election benefits from Mr. Harper, according to some. But what it meant from a budgetary point of view was to punch a hole in the revenue side of about $12 to $14 billion a year. Now, as I say to some of my students, well, they say, well, look, say we left it at 6. We just brought it down and we paused and said, well, we won't take it to 5 yet. Well, the money that we'd saved with not going to 5, we could have funded a national child care program, one of the best in the world, instantly. It would have cost $2 or $3 billion a year, and we could have funded it out of the GST revenue. One of the things I'm interested in on disability is we could invest and provide more meaningful services, supports, better transit, better education, truly inclusive, of a fairer country, a fairer community, more accessible, inclusive, with federal partnership with the provinces. 500 million, $1 billion, one can dream. But again, is it fanciful hallucinations? No. It can be pragmatic. One could have afforded it. These are practical dreams, not wild, crazy dreams that necessarily would be dismissed out of hand. So we're back in a political culture, I think, too. Most Canadians have an expectation, and I think the government's read this, and I think the other federal parties probably would agree, that there's a sense that it's okay to have deficits during recession, particularly at this time of a shock and a surprise to global economies and banking systems and investments. And we saw, particularly living beside the United States, I was in England last October, in Scotland, when the mighty Royal Bank of Scotland, who would have thought the Scottish would have been caught off guard with poor banking practices? Well, they were, and much to the chagrin of the Scottish Nationalist Party, which is the equivalent of the Bloc Québécois, the separatists of Scotland, they were bailed out by the Bank of England. Humble pie there by the Scottish Nationalists. So we lived in a very strange fall there, didn't we? Kind of watching some old investment companies like Lehman Brothers and others collapse, and things that were just General Motors. I mean, just giants, titans of capitalism seem to be brinking at the collapse.